welcome to today's lecture. This is a part of the University Global Fellowship lecture, but also MSD Distinguished Speakers Lecture Series. And we are extremely honored to have to welcome today's speaker, Professor A. Michael Spence. Professor Spence probably, I'm sure, doesn't need a detailed introduction. Everybody knows him in China, certainly, but also globally. I'll just say very briefly, Professor Spence is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, but he has a long, very distinguished career. I will only point to a couple of them. Professor Spence was a professor of economics at the Harvard University for a very long time. I think it's from 75 to 1990. And in between, he also served as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And then he moved to Stanford University to serve as the Dean, obviously Professor and the Dean of the Graduate School of Stanford Graduate School of Business. But we here, economists and the public, probably know Professor Spence's work, academic contribution, and he received a very, very long list of awards and prizes. I will only name two. One was, I think in 1981, if I got correct, he received the John Bates Clark Award from the American Economic Association, which is often awarded to distinguished economists below the age of 40. And number two, which is even better known, in 2001, he received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for his contribution to the subject of information asymmetry. Today, Professor Spence brings us a very new topic that we all care deeply about, which is the AI revolution. So without taking further time, I'll ask Professor Spence to deliver the lecture, and afterwards, we probably will open up for Q&A. So please, you can start to prepare your questions while he was giving the lecture. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Spence.
Bien Wang Yiping, ladies and gentlemen, I'm impressed. When we were coming over from the hotel in the car, we were talking about what would happen in the United States if we had a seminar on Sunday. And somebody said, well, you could do that, but there wouldn't be anybody in the seminar. So I'm impressed, again, and it's lovely to be back with all of you. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about this AI revolution that we're in the middle of. And it's got a lot of dimensions, so I'm not going to try to cover them all. And I think we should leave lots of time for conversation with Yiping and with all of you. So that's the kind of plan. But I do want to say, let me put it this way. I think in the last 2 months, I've given at least 45 talks to groups, companies, groups of people who are interested in what's going on in the United States with a sudden change in policy direction. And so I'm not going to sort of focus on that in the conversation, but I don't want to rule out that as part of the discussion. So if any of you have any insights, the purpose of those 45 talks was to try to make sense of a fairly chaotic situation. Not that you can eliminate the uncertainty, it's there, and it's having a big negative impact, but you can at least put parameters around things that I think put parameters around it that many people, including people in the United States, don't know. So, for example, 15% of China's exports go to the United States. Well, it's not a trivial number, but it's not huge. And somehow I think we Americans think we're more centrally located in the global economy than we really are. But for today, I will stick with digital technologies. So, Gen AI there was a famous paper written at Google by a very international group of distinguished scholars. It's in the open source world. These tech giants do a lot of basic research. And that paper was called Attention is All You Need. And it was a huge breakthrough that gave rise to a whole sequence of innovations that gave us the current version of generative AI. But that didn't really hit our consciousness until about 2022, when ChatGPT produced the first version of that, of the large language model. And shortly after that, McKinsey wrote a fairly influential paper that I just referenced here. And they basically said, even with conservative assumptions, the potential impact in terms of productivity in virtually any economy is just enormous. And these were I hope you can see it. These are the conservative estimates as of that time. And the reason for thinking that, just to kind of use economic terms, is this isn't just a general purpose technology, it's a super general purpose technology. Or to put it in ordinary language, it's extremely difficult to find anywhere in any economy where there isn't an application of this that has some significant potential impact either on the quality of service, the ability to deliver it to underserved populations, on productivity, and so on. And then a lot of things that we can't predict. I wrote a book that I'm pleased to say was published in Chinese by CITIC with Gordon Brown and Mohammed Alarian. This was written as we came out of the crisis, the pandemic. And it became clear to us, we were talking during the pandemic, it became very clear to us that the world was not going to look like the world that we entered the pandemic with in multiple dimensions. Now, the central banks agreed with that, sort of, but they thought most of the disruptions were going to resolve themselves, that they were transitory or temporary or something. And that's why they waited so long before they decided they couldn't wait any longer. And we had in the developed countries the largest and most rapid interest rate increases that we've had in a long, long time. And it probably, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm not being critical of the central banks, but simply it would have been better if we'd done this more gradually. And what became clear is that a bunch of things were changing. So the way we conceptualize that, and I'm just saying this to position what I want to talk about today, is the collision of three powerful sets of forces. One, it looked to us that the world economy was being subjected to increasingly large, frequent, and severe shocks, and they weren't going to stop. So we had a pandemic, we had geopolitical tensions, we had one war at the time we published the book. Now we had two, hopefully not more, etc. Climate shocks are ubiquitous. That's one set. Second set that tended not to get attention were secular headwinds to growth. Declining productivity trends in the United States, aging. Now you might say, what are you talking about, Mike? 66% of the world's population lives in countries that are young, where the fertility rates are high. They're not aging. Longevity varies when you look across those countries. But the aging group, that's North America, Europe, China, produces 80% of global GDP. So the young ones may eventually have a significant impact on the global economy, but not tomorrow. So that's step two. And we thought, you put those two together, and it feels like a very different world. And you could see the effects coming right away. You could see diversification in supply chains for the first time to try to deal with shocks and other fragmentation that was occurring in the global economy. You could see policy being made with a major focus on national security and defense, overriding economic considerations and so on. But the third set of things that we talked about, the third in this kind of colliding pattern, was a set of unbelievable breakthroughs in science and technology, of which the most visible one is the digital revolution in multiple ways. But there's also a revolution in biomedical and life sciences that's well known here because China's very prominent in moving that forward. And there's a significant third leg of the stool, which is the technology that underpins the energy transition and sustainability, where again, China is clearly in the lead, both on cost and technology in batteries, electric vehicles, solar, etc. And so what we tried to do in this book as best we could is to say, well, so how do you think about all these things coming together? And I don't know if we succeeded, but the part I want to talk about then is the third part in general and the technology in particular. This is just a snapshot of some of the extraordinary things that are happening in science and technology. Solar costs that used to be essentially uneconomic have come down by factors between 5 and 10 over a 10 to 15 year period. This is on the upper right-hand side. This is an old version of TSMC's product map. They were at the time converging on 2 nanometer separation of chips, etc. Extraordinary changes that, by the way, without which we would not have the AI revolution. We need this kind of computing power. DNA sequencing used to be very expensive. It's running in the neighborhood of $250 per complete sequence. We have gene editing. This thing here, I'll talk more about later. This is AlphaFold, DeepMind's prediction of the three-dimensional structure of proteins, and so on. The Nobel Prize went to the people who developed the messenger RNA technology that underpins the most successful vaccines. But this is really cancer-related research. It's targeted interventions to deal with disease, and so on. So, and here's some more. There's a global explosion of entrepreneurial activity. So, James Manika and I have written several things together. The last thing we wrote was around this time, late 2023, and it was essentially the same subject as the McKinsey Global Institute one, which is we wanted to make the case in a world, in our world, there were two attitudes toward this artificial intelligence. In Europe, it was negative. It was all risks. Now, that's partly because they don't have any of the tech giants that populate China and the United States. And the risks are real. But we thought there was a kind of understatement of the economic potential. And so we said it's enormous and it couldn't come at a better time. Right? If you have, just put yourself in an economy that's aging, has challenges with productivity, has rising debt, including sovereign debt, and rising interest rates, closing off fiscal space, and rising dependency ratios because of the way the old age population like me has to be taken care of. And the one thing you would like to have for those young people is a productivity surge. And I think it's pretty obvious. So we tried to make that case, and we tried to make the case that it's not automatic, that you can't leave it up to the private sector alone. There are serious questions about diffusion, right? So if you look at, and this has been done in studies in a lot of different places, if you look at previous rounds of digital adoption, like the automation of codifiable tasks. I have a few graphs on it later, but you know what I'm talking about. Humans do something and we know exactly logically the steps they take. You can code it, and then the machine can do it, and those jobs disappeared. Clerks, much of the keeping of corporate accounts, CRP systems, etc. But if you look at the pattern of adoption, the tech sector is always up here, and the financial sector is usually very far behind. And by that time you get down to hospitality and aspects of healthcare, education to some extent, you find not no activity, but huge lags. And so the pattern's divergence. And what James and I said, I think it's an important statement, is the big benefit, the productivity surge, if you like, only comes if it spreads throughout the economy. That is, if the potential is actually realized. And that involves, at least in the world of economics and business, a lot of change that takes time. New business models, new skills, new ways of thinking, new mindsets, etc. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. These are just some interesting publications that I've seen. James wrote in an article with one of his colleagues at Google that it's a little bit like philosophy, but it asks a question that at least I personally am interested in, which is AI changing the way we understand human intelligence, the way humans understand things? And it's just a fascinating essay. The Human Development Report, I will mention, this year was specifically on artificial intelligence. I think it's quite good. It's long. You probably want to get, something like Notebook LM to summarize it for you. But it basically makes the point that the potential is large, but it has to be done in such a way that it preserves and enhances human, not only welfare, but agency, right? And so on. And finally, on the question of jobs and what the impact is going to be, I just want to reference our colleague at MIT, David Otto, who's done just stupendously good work over a long period of time on the impact of technology, on the impact of globalization. And David's view, which is expressed in this article, is that there's a reasonably good chance that Gen AI, or the current portfolio, of artificial intelligence technologies actually won't have the job and income polarization effect. That is, it won't hollow out the middle class if we do it right. And I want to emphasize that because I'm going to argue later that the natural use of these things is as a digital machine human collaboration, or what's sometimes called augmentation, and not full-throated automation. You will know, of course, that the previous round was full-throated automation, right? There was no way to interact with these things. But the jury's out on that front, so we'll come back to that. And finally, Stanford every year publishes an AI index report. And this one's particularly interesting because it comes post DeepSeek and post a whole bunch of really important, very rapid changes in the kind of landscape. And so let me summarize a couple of those. I'm not going to go into them in great detail. The first, most obvious one is that whatever gap there was between US and China is closing, and it's closing fairly rapidly. And that's because there's a huge amount of talent here. They're innovating, and they have innovated in lots of dimensions, and one of them which is find more ways, efficient ways to train the AIs. And DeepSeek's an example of that, and I know there are others who are doing the same thing. So that gap's closing, and that's a good thing. The cost of training and querying is falling, and that's an innovation everywhere, and that's a good thing too. There's this may not be quite as visible, but there is quite a large increase in smaller models. That is, not the behemoths like, ChatGPT 4 point whatever it is now, the full-blown version of Gemini or Anthropic. And going along with that, the open source component of the AI universe is getting larger. So if you go back 2 years, there were mostly proprietary, AI models closed. And then the question was, who's going to get access to them and who's going to use them? And now I think the question's different, right? We've got a choice. They're not the same, and there's a lot of writing now about who's adopting which version and why, both on the production and the consumption side of that thing. There's an expansion of what some people call agentic AI, that is agents that do really quite complex tasks. And we have to learn how to use them, and we have to learn how to constrain them because if you give them too much freedom, they can do some remarkable things if you don't tell them what the guardrails are. And finally, and I'm going to talk about this, I think the thing that we're seeing just almost right away is a very large, rapid, and spreading intersection of AI in the sciences. So in biomedical science, it's not just AlphaFold, which I'll describe in a minute for the small number of people who don't know what it is. But it's occurring right across the horizon in biology. I invested in a physics startup. This is pretty speculative stuff, but you probably know that when you design complex devices that have electrons and photons and whatnot, you have to figure out whether they're going to work, right? And the way you do that is you don't build it. It's too expensive because they often don't work. What you do is simulate it. And what a simulation basically is a carefully specified set of differential equations with boundary conditions that tell you how that thing's going to work. And then you turn a very powerful computer loose for about a weekend with what's called a solver. And the solver tells you how the thing's going to behave. And what these young people are trying to do is to figure out whether the AIs can detect the patterns in what solvers do and do what it takes a weekend to do in about 5 minutes. And when you think about it, I'm not sure they'll succeed, but I mean, that's an example of what I'm talking about. You have models coming out that predict weather patterns, with 2 or 3 times the accuracy of going out the time. You have a Google AI-driven weather forecasting thing that's designed to predict severe weather events. And apparently, 12 hours in advance, it can predict a severe weather event within a 5-kilometer radius within 15 minutes of when it'll hit. 12 hours before, and it takes 1 minute to that's not going to show up in GDP, but it might save a lot of lives. And I think we're just at the start of all of this. So that's pretty exciting stuff. The reason I mentioned science is that the way I think about these things is we're going to see big effects in the economy, but they're going to take longer, right? So the current chief economist at Google, very smart young guy, describes what we're seeing now in the economy as green shoots. Whereas in the sciences, if you hand people a powerful tool, they just pick it up and use it. There's none of this change the business model, inertia, et cetera, that we associate correctly. And it's a legitimate feature of the way economies and businesses evolve. So I'll spend a minute on AlphaFold. AlphaFold is the DeepMind project on predicting the three-dimensional structure of protein. So you probably know a protein is defined by a sequence, very specific sequence of amino acids. But then if you want to know how it'll behave, what it'll bind to and whatnot, you have to know its 3D structure. This can be determined in a lab using a whole bunch of technologies like crystallography. Takes very highly trained people, somewhere between months and years, to figure it out for a single protein. And that had been done for something like 180,000 proteins. So there was a training data set. So DeepMind didn't do that work, but they set out with a combination of AI and biology knowledge to see if they could predict the three-dimensional structure of protein. These are prediction machines. This is not, AlphaFold does not give you the answer, right? It gives you a prediction. Well, it worked pretty well. That's not quite the same level of accuracy across all proteins. And then they did something really interesting. There's a video, if you can see it. They were in a meeting after they realized they succeeded, and they said, well, what are we going to do with this? And somebody said, well, why don't we predict the three-dimensional structure of all 200 million known proteins and publish it as an open source database? And Demis Hassabis, one of the Nobel Prize winners for this work, said, that's a good idea. And so they did. And within months, there are 2.6 million biologists, biomedical scientists all over the world using it. So that's the kind of progress I think we can see. And it's going to occur in the basic research side. You may, a bit of an aside, there is a slightly worrying, more than slightly worrying pattern of withdrawing funding for basic science and applied science and technology research in the United States, and under the current administration. You may wonder whether that will cripple the AI progress in the United States. It wouldn't be confined to AI. And the answer to that's probably no. And the reason is something you may or may not know, which comes from data from the National Science Foundation. In a broad portfolio of digital technology areas, quantum, AI, etc., the funding for the basic, when I say basic research, I mean non-proprietary, right? Nobody's trying to monetize it. They just publish papers. Think of it as the academic field. A third of that is supported by the government. A third of it is done and supported by the tech giants, at least on the American side. And a third is philanthropy. So 2/3 are not vulnerable to this, whatever's going to happen on the public sector side and the funding. That's not true of all of science. And so this is not it's not the occasion not to worry about it, but at least I think the technology side is relatively durable. There is a problem, however. I think it's less of a problem here, but I'm hoping in the next 2 or 3 days to find out more. And that is that the academic side can't compete. So this brings me to, what is the stuff you need to do this? The first thing you need is talent, right? That we have, you have in China. It's scarcer in other places. But the other two key ingredients are high-speed networks, so you can get at the data. There's enough digital data to do this, unless you're doing a very specialized application. So this isn't like, e-commerce or certain parts of fintech where the value is in the data and it's controlled by various entities. The data is not the problem. The problem is getting to it. I mean, the main constraint is computing power, or what the technologists call compute. And that's why these semiconductor restrictions, they're probably not going to work, but that's why they're being put in place. Well, so where's the computing power? Well, if you look around, it's basically in the cloud computing systems that the tech giants have built for another purpose. And then they add the GPUs, the graphic processing units, that are especially well adapted to the training of AIs. And there is no academic equivalently powerful entity. And so when if somebody wants to do their work in an academic setting, they have two problems. One, they have to use these computing resources that are not available to the scientific community. You've got to go buy them. And secondly, the tech giants pay more, right? So there's a fairly big asymmetry that I don't think serve as well. The open source, and it would be better if it were better balanced, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. Here's the models becoming cheaper. I'll leave these with you, but there's a ton of data on this now. This is China catching up. It's really quite dramatic. I think, you know, to the first approximation, we're on a par. And probably in terms of human resources, China is in an advantageous position. Here's speed and size. What this does is, you know, sort of for various technologies, how many of them were there? Well, mainframes, you know, we had about 1 million units. Mini computers, we had 10 million. PCs, you know, fairly quickly, you know, we had 300 million. The desktop internet, more. The revolutionary development is the mobile internet, right? So that takes us to 4 billion and hopefully most of the world's population over time. And now with AI, it's kind of in the stratosphere. This is ChatGPT. I put this up not because the numbers are particularly interesting, but because the speed is just breathtaking, right? 100 million users in the first 2 months, stuff coming down the pike. And the reason I think this is interesting to economists is speed of this type is very hard to manage from an organizational point of view, right? So I can, you know, maybe in the discussion we'll have this conversation, but there's a very big difference between stuff that comes in at a slower pace and people and individuals and organizations can adapt at approximately the same pace. But this, what's going on now, is way beyond the capacity of most organizations to adapt. And so I think, you know, the correct conclusion is that this is going to be in multiple dimensions pretty disruptive. Just trying to keep up. I won't talk about all these, but these are milestones over time. I found this quite interesting. There's 2 graphs. These are milestones in the timeline of digital technologies with a huge acceleration. I mean, it's quite detailed on the artificial intelligence side. It's probably important to say that the general public encounters AI through Gen AI. And there's a good reason for that. It's super accessible. You need no technical training whatsoever, right? There is no version of AI prior to that where you don't have to speak some language that a computer understands. Whereas this is just, you just ask it a question or give it a query or, you know, prompt or whatever they call them these days and start to get answers and you learn from it. The second thing that makes LLMs and Gen AI distinctive is it's also the first AI that is not domain specific. What do I mean by that? I mean, you have AIs that do proteins. You have AIs that, you know, recognize images, right? That was a big breakthrough. I think the image recognition revolution, you know, passed the human benchmark in around 2015, something like that. But the LLMs appear to have a human-like ability to know what you're talking about without you having to tell it. So if I asked it a question about the Italian Renaissance and then ask it to write computer code and then something about mathematics, it just knows. And that's something we thought that was a human characteristic. I'll go quickly through these, you know. These are top 10 things that these things can do. Probably this is pretty accurate. This tends to be ChatGPT focused. And it is the largest in terms of use LLM in the world. The next one, which is what are they going to be able to do in 10 years, I think is more speculative at this point, so I won't try to sell that. This relates to what I just said. So the academic, the long history of AI is the theory that underpins neural networks and whatnot precedes by a lot its implementation. So it goes way back into the 1960s and 70s when Jeff Hinton was doing his work and others. Then there was no ability to implement it because of data and computing power at scale. We're talking about you know, models with 1 trillion parameters in them, so we weren't even close. Then there was an AI winter, and then there was a period where the academic world was the main player in the artificial intelligence world, and sometime around the middle of the past decade, that the industry, meaning the tech giants, the Alibabas, the Baidus, you know, the TikToks and ByteDances, and on our side, you know, Microsoft, Meta, etc., kind of took over. And we now know the reason, right? They took seriously the research in this area. They do have some commitment to the basic research, and they had the computing power and the networks. They were set up, you know, to be able to do this by by virtue of their previous activity. Emerging AI applications. So on the upper left, you can see DeepMind. You have universal translation. I have a crazy idea. I'll share with you. So when I talk to people about AI, I think, there's an awful lot of talk about jobs and this and that and businesses. But at some fundamental level, we're very close in the world to having everybody have I don't know what to call it, a digital assistant, a research assistant, a tutor that has the following properties. It's read everything in every language, in every field. And at some reasonable level that we can debate relative to humans, understands what it's read. And it's an astonishingly powerful tool for learning. I call it, the digital tool for people who are curious. And it's not a substitute for learning. It's just an accelerant, just like the AlphaFold is. AlphaFold gives you a huge head start. If I want to know, so I gave a Gemini a little test. I asked it, I picked a field I knew something about, which is the Italian Renaissance. And I asked it, could you tell me the literature I should read when I want to deepen my knowledge in this? And it took 15 seconds and answered. And I knew enough about it so that it didn't goof. And then it said, do you want more research done on this? And I said, yes. And then it took 15 minutes. I produced an 11-page paper with 8 pages of references. You've seen this. I was a really good guide to how to go about becoming knowledgeable about this. Final codicil on this. But when I talk to my academic colleagues, Marshall, I don't know if you agree with this, but there's an awful lot of hand-wringing. What if they get, the LLM to write the paper, right? How are we going to test it? And so my answer to that is, and I think the tendency in that discussion is, maybe we shouldn't use this stuff too much, right? And I think that's crazy. You can't take one of the more powerful learning tools that we've ever had and decide not to use it because there's ways to misuse it. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So this is overly simple, and I apologize for this to all of you who live and work in the academic world. But I think there are answers to this. I mean, when we have students writing papers and doing research, we teach them the values that go along with that. You have to disclose the references, the sources that you used. And I don't think this is any different. You just have to disclose it. And you for sure don't use it in the automation substitution mode and hand in a paper. And if you do, you may or may not get caught. I'll tell you, if you're a lawyer and you hand it in a court, you'll get caught. And the reason is the AI will make up the legal precedents. This actually happened. In an early version of ChatGPT, a lawyer had ChatGPT write the legal brief and handed it into the court. And every single legal precedent didn't exist. And that gentleman's in fairly big trouble. So what about testing? So I have an answer to that too. So remember, the objective is learning, not passing tests, right? So we probably can't rely on writing papers and stuff. But we all know as faculty members that if we sit down in a room with somebody with no technology at all in the room for 15 minutes and talk, we'll know if the person learned something or not. So the bottom line is, I think we've got this incredibly powerful tool. And the reason I focus on it, starting with education, but not lingering there, is I think a lot of the core of what we're talking about isn't really just about organizations, and adopting technology, although that's an important part of the economic impact. But the core, the fundamental thing, is empowering people, to be able to do things better, faster, and whatnot than they did before. So I'm almost done. There's a whole bunch of data here that it won't surprise you. Electricity demand is going through the roof, and we're going to have to figure out a green way to supply that, etc. So let me kind of skip down to the end and talk a little bit. This graph, by the way, this is just Google had, their developer kind of product announcements. This is just in the Gemini, world. I mean, the details don't matter, but you can see it's like standing in front of a tsunami, and they're not unique by any means. This is the open source versus closed source business. So they each have their advantages in terms of controllability and whatnot. And the world out there is not tipping in one direction or the other. They're both going to thrive, I think, as alternatives that will be adopted by people in various ways. this is, I put this up. This is the performance of the LLMs in basically it's called a level 5 mathematics test. And it was pretty crappy for a long period of time. And then it started getting better, but then DeepSeek. The thing that got everybody's attention in January was the reasoning model. There were earlier versions of the DeepSeek model that were quite impressive and good, but they didn't get everybody's attention. It was that they basically tied the most advanced reasoning models from OpenAI and Google, and then more performance data. When I put this together, I realized I wouldn't cover it all. I think for the foreseeable future, I live in Europe. For the foreseeable future, Kai-Fu Lee is right, that there will be two, basically, artificial intelligence in terms of development giants, and they are right where we're sitting, and the other one on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And the differences are just enormous. I mean, now hopefully that won't just completely leave other people out. I mean, Mistral in France is a significant player, and it's not that there's no activity elsewhere. But I think for now, and there's no reasonable expectation that Europe will quickly join this party. I don't think, in spite of an intention over a longer period of time, as expressed in the Mario Draghi report and other documents, that they ought to be moving in that direction. The reason this is important, it allows me to make one other point, and which is this. 20 years ago, if we were talking about this, we'd think of tech sectors, right? So we had all these free services, location-based services and whatnot, and that was nice. And people try to measure the benefits because they're all free. I think Eric Nelson and company have done important work in that dimension. And it's not trivial at all. But we've evolved to the point where the importance of this technology isn't just that it has a bunch of dynamic services and interesting startups and reasonably good new services, some of which are very inclusive in their impact on people's lives. It's that it's the toolkit to transform the entire economy. So take Germany. Germany is an industrial powerhouse, similar to South Korea and China, but it does not have the toolkit. Or the concern is it doesn't have the toolkit. And if you don't have it, and it's mostly digital, you don't have it, then eventually, slowly but surely, your automobile industry and a whole bunch of other industries will start to slide into being underperformers and so on. I can't overstate this point. And, I can live with a proposition in Europe that we're behind and it doesn't matter that much. We just have, Google and Microsoft around doing it for us. It's that you need the software engineers and the people to implement this across the entire economy. And so I think the concern is very real. Finally, I'll talk a bit about work. There is probably a pretty strong automation bias in the way people think about this. You don't have to listen to a bunch of CEOs for very long to discover a subset of them think, this is great. I can get rid of all the people in the customer service operation and stick it in an AI. I think that's not going to work very well. In all the applications, and we have a rising library, if you like, of use cases now, almost all of them do not involve full automation. Yes, they're partial automation. I mean, the way I think about it is the way it's often put, which is these things will write the first draft of anything, right? Doctors' reports, computer code, etc. But they're not good enough yet to take that computer code or that doctor's report and say that's it. That's the final product. So if you define the product as the first draft, it's full automation. If you define it as the final draft, right, the real thing, then it's machine-human collaboration that takes away stuff that the machines do better and faster, and augments the human's performance. I mean, I don't mean to trivialize it, but it sounds like it's linguistics more than other things. But the bottom line is the appropriate use of this appears to be in use case after use case that it's machine-human collaboration. And you can rank the AIs roughly in, well, they don't quite meet the human benchmarks, or they're about the same, or they're superhuman, like the learning assistant that we talked about before. I mean, no humans can read everything, right? And they all have their uses. So I teach a course on on growth and development. And we're talking about this, and it turns out there's lots of examples of this kind in education technology. And this is a healthcare example. You can, this has been done, train an AI to recognize skin cancer from pictures. But it's not, doesn't meet the human benchmark, which would be what dermatologists do. By way of diagnosis, they also take the things out, which the AI does. So I say to the class, so what do you think? And they say, well, nice try, didn't make it this time. And I say, okay. And I said, what do you mean by that? They say, I'm going to the dermatologist. And I said, well, that's a good decision. I said, but probably 85% of the world's population doesn't live near a dermatologist. And they go, oh. And then you realize, even if it's not the same as having a dermatologist, you have a pretty powerful tool for preventive primary care. For people, who need a warning to get on the train and go 85 kilometers to an urban center and get something checked, because they won't get it checked otherwise. The benefit cost calculation doesn't work. That's an example of an AI that doesn't, even beat a human benchmark, any reasonable benchmark, but has very useful, potential, inclusive type applications. Now, jobs. If you accept that we're going to somehow avoid, the wrong kind of full-throated automation, we still have a potential problem, and it has two parts. So suppose we get a big productivity surge, a very big one, right? Sustained over time. Now imagine you're in a sector with a very low elasticity of demand. You all know, everybody in the room is an economist, right? Low elasticity means the costs go down and the demand doesn't go up very much. Then you're going to lose jobs, period, right? We're not going to have as many people writing media copy, unless I'm wrong, and the elasticity of demand for media copy is greater than one. People say, well, what about software engineers? We'll need fewer of them because JIT operates the code. And I'm sure there are Chinese equivalents of that. And I say, well, maybe, but I'm not sure what the elasticity is. But I think it's a fair statement that we're building part of the foundations of the entire economy on software. So it's not totally obvious that a productivity surge there is going to actually produce, a transitory employment problem. So I think the bottom line is it's open. But the one thing you can be sure of is that it won't be the same as you go across job sectors and so on. So there's going to be a lot of movement and disruption and whatnot, and a lot of help that people are going to need in making those transitions. And I think that at this point is as far as we can get. I mean, we just don't know, exactly how this is going to be adopted. I talked to a group of labor economists in Milan, and they clearly wanted to know what was AI going to do to the job market. And this did not make me popular. I said, look, you don't want to do that. You ask the question in that way. And they said, why? And I said, well, look, there's millions of entities out there, organizations, businesses, and they're all trying to figure out how to use this technology. I said, so it's possible you'll figure it out before they do, but I doubt it. Okay? So that doesn't mean you shouldn't think about it. Think about steering it, think about what direction it might take, what policies will make it take better directions. It's not, but I said, just to clinch the argument, oh, by the way, and if you could figure it out before they did with the existing technology, 2 months from now, it won't be the same technology, so you'll have to do it again, right? And I think that's a fair characterization of where we are. We want, just like the Human Development Report this year and a whole lot of other people, are trying to think creatively and constructively about how to guide this without pretending to make very accurate forecasts about where it's headed. I'm going to stop there, but this is the routine job stuff that I put it in here just for those of you who haven't seen it before. But it's not the right use of time now. I will tell you that I've run into a lot of people who think this was automation and the AI revolution is just another version of this. And I think it's terribly important. And the Human Development Report does a good job of saying that's not an accurate characterization of what's going on in the AI world. Yiping, let me pause there. Thanks, everybody.